In the US, about 30% of gym members are actually coming into the gym either with a program that they're following on their phone or a program that they got online.
Soft skills, I would argue, is the one thing that AI is never going to be able to replace. And soft skills are just not taught anymore.
The role of the trainer has gotten so complex, I would argue that there's more of a need of education because I think that it needs to be more in depth, it needs to be longer.
Social media and technology has clearly changed the game on a number of levels. Number one is that when people look for a trainer, they use some form, whether it's a podcast or Instagram or TikTok or whatever. So consumers are going there, and then they're looking at the influence of these people and what they're posting and how regularly they're posting. And in some cases, they're choosing their fitness expert by what they're achieving on social media. Sometimes how they look, sometimes what they say, and in some cases, they may not always have the qualifications to support that. Well, we've really got the hardcore people that really care in the audience. These are the ones that sort of sit right to the end of the event just to come and see you, Richard. That's commitment.
Wow. Yep.
That's your fan base or your family.
Definitely appreciate it.
We're talking about personal training, and there's been a lot of talk about personal trainers being kind of overtaken by robots and AI, and how they're going to be disappearing very, very quickly, or quicker than what we've realized. So I thought what would be a good is give us a little bit of maybe a little bit of a history, personal training since the pandemic, because that seems to be a moment in time which has sort of shifted the role of personal trainers. Where are we today, and how do we get here?
I blame Mo for thinking that everyone's going to be replaced by AI and robots. So
I don't think
that's
I
on
ever
you,
said
Mo.
that.
Yeah, I think if you look at pre-pandemic, personal training across the world was actually pretty consistent and was actually growing at a pretty good clip. Companies like Equinox and Lifetime Fitness were doing really, really well. And then it was really, no matter what sort of demographic or geographic place that I was visiting or looking at, PT seemed to be booming. And then COVID hit, and then it's never, ever really been the same. And some of the really successful club chains that I know are literally down 50 to 60% in PT revenue. And what I think the number one question is they're sort of asking themselves, well, how did it happen? And how do we get here? And then I think where this is evolving with this chat is, where does that then take us? What's that next step? And I think one of the biggest things from speaking to people like Joe in the audience and others is around post-pandemic time, pre-pandemic time, trainers always had what we called a bit of an authority. So there was a fairly large gap between a trainer's knowledge and the general consumer. And what we found was that really allowed personal training to really keep growing and to flourish. And what happened was during COVID, people went home, they weren't going to the gyms anymore, they created their own home gyms, and then they started to realize that they couldn't go back to their facilities. So trainers were looking for other options, so they were starting to get online training. They were, if anything did start to pop up, they would go to that quickly in terms of like a boutique-style studio rather than going back into the bigger clubs. And what that did was, what we found was the audience then also, because they were now at home working out, they were actually starting to then look for their own resources. And the resources they were finding were pretty good. And so they started to say, well, I don't probably need a trainer anymore. Or even if they weren't considering it or being approached now post-pandemic in a club, they're really saying, you know what, no, I'm good. I've got my online coach, or I've got great programming. I can use AI now to develop some amazing programs. Do I really need a trainer? And I think that really hurt the personal training gap because the consumer came back really educated. And that has made a really big dent into definitely the revenue side of it, but it's also really made clubs have to really rethink about that process. And also what happened was the really, really top trainers, what they ended up doing was they started to realize that online was a pretty good place where they could actually survive. And that started to thrive. So we lost a lot of the really, really top people within that. And probably the biggest one I noticed across the board is my background. I'm obviously a bit biased towards the education and training, but I've got some anecdotal stories around why that's so significant. But what I noticed is it pretty much vanished. So all education and training, tiered systems that were all really driving the PTs and allowing them to become a really sort of high-level educated trainer, they've all been removed. So what's happened is the consumers now come in almost as knowledgeable as the trainer. And trying to sell PT when your knowledge is almost the same as the person sitting in front of you, it's a very, very hard proposition.
Well, it's interesting how we initially got connected because you had reached out or you had heard about some things that we'd done. And you said, I've been in this industry, I left the industry, and I'm coming back. This is maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I'm coming back into the industry, and so much has changed. And now people tell me you're the guy. But it's funny now when you said, I've changed how personal training is. I think technology has also gone through a realization of, one, how much can you push technology versus the role of the humans? I've realized that I've been in the industry for 13 years. And sure, coming in, being nascent about it, not understanding a lot about how the levers that you pull work. When I came in, I was like, technology can replace personal trainers. But the reality is you get into the emotional connection, the motivational side, the community side. It's like even getting a massage from a robot. I mean, we were talking about this. There's a couple of really good, very good robotic massage companies, but I'm like, if I'm going to pay $135 a session, I'd rather get massaged by a human, right? Because they got the little nuances that could be specific about you. And I think you touched on so many good things, sir. One, COVID was transformative for personal training. For all the things that you talked about, the best trainers had to go and make a living for themselves and found out that they can actually make more money outside the gym than in the gym. So then it had us rethink, are we compensating these people correctly? Second, are we giving them the right tools, right? Like you talked about, the technologies. Our gyms, in a lot of ways, the personal training tools at the gym was less sophisticated than what they could get on their own independently. And I think the third one, which I want to touch on, is the consumer, the member coming in. So today, depending on which market you look at, but in the US, about 30% of gym members are actually coming into the gym either with a program that they're following on their phone or a program that they got online. Compare that to even the best gyms, personal training penetration, let's just pick 10%. It's lower. I'm being very generous with that.
Very generous, yeah.
Being very generous. But even if you take 10%, so if 30% of the people are doing programs on their phone, what we always thought about is, well, how can a PT be complementary to what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mo, you touched on a lot of really relevant points there, and I was just joking about you trying to replace PT. Yeah, I mean, I think, when you look at as Michelle Dowcourt calls it, he calls the emerging future of fitness and personal training and all that side of it. It really will be, whether you like it or not, AI is going to replace the program design component. So I was even talking to one of the certification companies yesterday, and I'm like, I really actually question whether we would even include program design anymore, even in a certification. Because if it's going to be done by AI and it's already doing it really well, and it's pulling references from millions of different types of programs from elite, coaches, then we have to then say, okay, well, what is that future going to look like then? Because if you're somebody that's an S&C coach or an S&C trainer and that's your focus, and you were primarily designing a program and that was your difference, that's now vanished. So then what do we then focus on? And I think if you look at some of the really top clubs in terms of the post-pandemic side, there were trainers that had to work their way through for 8 to 9 years to get to some of these top levels within these clubs. And so they devoted a lot of time, a lot of education, sometimes their own money, to become a top-tier trainer to be able to earn the top bracket. And post-COVID, what happened was a lot of the new trainers coming in, entry-level, were allowed to charge the same rates as the trainers that spent 8 or 9 years. So all of those trainers left. And so you had this massive divide now between all of your main guys left. And what did they do with them? They took their clients with them. So clubs lost not only their top sort of paying member, but they also lost their top trainers. And if you look at what Jeff was saying yesterday about the consumer, Jeff Zwiefel from Lifetime, which some of the most beautiful clubs you've ever seen, he was saying that his consumers are so well educated now that for them, they have to really be on their game because the consumer is coming into your point now, Mo, 30% with programs and maybe it's even higher than that now. So I think it's really shifted how we think about that right now. So, and what is that evolution going to look like?
Do you think some of it has been brought on, as us as an industry have brought it on ourselves? Like going back years ago, like you had PT on the net, and there was a number of companies that were around then, and some are still around, where, as you said, the level of education, the amount of time that you had to study to become a top trainer was pretty significant. And then prior to the pandemic, certainly when I was in the UK at the time, I remember there was just this big, a lot of competition from almost like a weekend course, and you could become a personal trainer. Price to get in, entry point from a price perspective was extremely low, and it seemed as though the quality really, really came down. And I just wonder, what do you think there was a correlation between the commoditization of the education and the COVID situation that's almost like sort of forced this change as well? And do you think really we now need to be putting more focus on the education and sort of almost like broadening what the trainers now deliver to the consumer?
Yeah, I mean, Matt, I think if you look at it, right, soft skills, I would argue, is the one thing that AI is never going to be able to replace. And soft skills are just not taught anymore. That was probably the most basic thing that was always taught in sort of every type of learning environment, and now it's vanished. And the soft skills were the ones that made that connection, the emotional piece, the part that really is the personal in personal training. And a great example I have is I presented so Lifetime Fitness was one of my clients with PT on the Net for a really long time. And at about the 7-year mark in, they were doing incredibly well. And I asked to meet with Jeff and with Bahram and the team. And I said, can you come with me and can you, don't tell me the figures, but tell me the top 20 performing clubs in PT revenue and tell me your top 20 performing trainers. And I turned up to the meeting and I didn't know those numbers. And I got 19 of the 20 clubs right, and I got 20 out of 20 of the trainers right. And all I was looking at was the data from PT on the Net in terms of usage. And I knew that if a fitness manager focused on education, then that means all their trainers would be focused on education. And I knew that that would drive revenue. And it was almost 100% correlated. So what's happening now is because that's been removed, what I'm finding now is that people are wondering, I think they're trying to blame maybe COVID for that, but there is no training and education in those systems now. And I think the low value clubs have a little bit to blame with that because a lot of them don't have training, or the training was really pushed down as not an important component of their added revenue model. And so I think that's hurt it. I think some of the boutiques hurt it. And then I think COVID, with just everybody removing the contents, made a really big difference. So these fantastic trainers that could drive a high price product, I would now say that it's, to your point, Matt, I would say that the quality's not there. Now, there's obviously exceptions to every rule. There's still some great trainers, but they're not in the clubs anymore. They've gone to places like Until. They've gone to all these different places now where they can earn more money, and it's changed things dramatically.
Are seated machines slowing your members down? With many people spending the whole day sitting in their car, at the office, and in front of screens, then you have to ask yourself, should you really be sitting down when you're exercising? As seated machines do not promote all body movement, then a solution that encourages standing, putting the body in an upright position, will make workouts more effective. Help your members break from sedentary habits with more active training. Are you interested in creating a more dynamic workout environment? Then contact us today.
Do you think there has to be a reset in thinking about compensation and rates for personal trainers? And I say that because when you think about the role of a personal trainer, I look at this as an employer post-pandemic, where we used to have, 4 offices, I think 5 offices all over. At least people used to come in. We had like an HR person in each one. You got to kind of deal with the issues that they're having. But during the pandemic, a lot of times the employees' problems became the employer's problems. Childcare, school, all the things around that. The personal trainer, to me, also has an increased role. Number one, think about the member coming in maybe now with a wearable. they're coming in with a program that they got from ChatGPT, and the trainer has to justify that.
Yep.
They also are, they were a lot of times their therapists before, but they're most of their therapists now in a lot of ways. They're also filling this void of friendship because you used to go to the office and have relationships there, and now that's the person that you talk to, once, 2, 3 times a week. So the role of the trainer has gotten so complex. I would argue that there's more of a need of education because I think that it needs to be more in depth. It needs to be longer, just because that role has gotten so much more meaningful post-pandemic. And I just don't think they're compensated correctly for it. I don't think we're attracting the best and brightest for it. So what do you think, about the future of personal training, and how do we get them back in?
Yeah, a good question, Mo. And I think there's a couple of layers to that. I think in terms of comp, the comp structure will only change if we can bring the revenue back. I don't think changing the comp structure now when the revenue's down will benefit the club. So I think they're going to have to invest and find ways to bring the revenue back and then start to change the comp structure to get some of the better guys back, or to educate the new ones through to get them to the higher levels. And I think the way that you do that is it's a mix, right? It has to change. So I think where the change starts is, rather than somebody just being a personal trainer, ultimately the shift will come where they will move to becoming a health coach. And Michelle's been talking about this for years, and he's worked with the Singapore government around this. He's worked with a lot of different people thinking around how is this going to merge across. And to your point, Mo, they become more important, I think, because not only do they now address wellness, so now we're affecting a lot of different components. So what will happen is, and again, bringing in on the technology side, is I believe the future will be a trainer will have a dashboard, and the dashboard will have the information coming in from the wearable, the information coming in from the assessment, the information coming in from even like one of the recovery designs we're doing in Hong Kong. Everyone's going to have the saliva testing done. That comes into the recovery coach, who's a trainer. And then all of that dashboard now is then something that the trainer can now direct. And I think what that does is it adds more value. It gives them more touch points, to your point, Mo. And I think that allows them to start to bring more revenue back in. So the trainer might not just focus on 3 times a week with a client. There may be one session in there that's just a recovery only session. There may be one session in there that's sitting down and helping them go through their results from their DNA. And we know that we can affect the epigenetic side from a trainer's perspective really well, because we're talking about lifestyle. So it's a really important thing. And I think the shift is actually really exciting. And I think it's just a matter of, because I almost feel like it was almost like about 6 months ago, like a lot of the clubs had almost given up. And they're just like, this is just not working. What do we do? Do we look for AI to just replace the whole job? And that's where I got a bit fired up on social media to say, no, it's still the responsibility, because the trainer can influence and affect someone's life and change it. And I know so many wonderful trainers that can literally change someone's life around. And it is the emotional piece, it's that connection piece. And when we start to talk about wellness, they can touch them on so many different points. I think the shift is going to be, if it's just a fitness focus and you're a trainer, I think that model's almost dead. I think it's dead or dying. And I think it's going to have to shift. And I really like, and I think, Mo, you've actually helped me open my eyes to this a little bit too. I think AI can actually really help the trainer. And I think the wearables and all that side of it can really drive a trainer that can have a bigger influence. And so, and even if you look at the show here, there's so many great new devices are out, which then feed data back to the trainer or to the coach. So I think if that answered the question correctly, I think that's sort of where I sort of see that going.
I wonder if technology has permanently shifted this model. Like you said, there are some operators that are worried whether it's going to come back. And then you instantly followed that up by saying you went onto social media. Social media and technology has clearly changed the game on a number of levels. Number one is that when people look for a trainer, they use some form, whether it's a podcast or Instagram or TikTok or whatever. So consumers are going there, and then they're looking at the influence of these people and what they're posting and how regularly they're posting. And in some cases, they're choosing their fitness expert by what they're achieving on social media. Sometimes how they look, sometimes what they say, and in some cases they may not always have the qualifications to support that. But that's a big factor in their choice of who to follow from a program perspective. And then it seems as though it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because if somebody has built a social media following and credibility, do they actually need to be working for a gym or a business, because they've now created their own following and they've got sponsorship deals and all kinds of stuff going on? So how do you see that playing? And is it a case of the gyms are going to have to step up and embrace some of these people that are successful and pay more money and sort of want them to be part of their business? Or, how do you see all that playing out?
I think it's a really good point. I think the ones that are successful won't be coming back to health clubs. I think they've found their new place to earn their revenue. They've got their audience, and I think that's great. And however they fulfill that, whether it's in a boutique at their garage or if it's just all online, I think that's not going to go away now. I think that's now permanent. I think what the clubs have to focus on is, for instance, I'll give you an example. So most people, I would argue, coming into a facility have some sort of niggle, restriction, possibly in pain. When you do a PT consultation, if it's done correctly and it's done well, you can take that person, find out what's going on with them at that point in time by asking lifestyle-based questions, getting them to move, maybe taking some of the fluid data from in-body. And you can use that to then say, okay, here's where this person is now at today. But what you do then, the piece that's missing, is you now take them onto the floor and you help them with that restriction. And we don't like to say the word pain in PT, but most people that we deal with a lot of times are in some form of pain. If you can help with that, that's a touch point which no one will ever get on social media. It's not something that they can get through AI. That's something that it's delivered directly by a person that understands the tissues of the body and understands how to get somebody to move and feel better. And I think that's where the education piece is so relevant, because if we don't have those skills, we can't change that. We can't change that person, because to your point, we're competing with some pretty powerful people on social media that have a big voice. And if they say something's blue, then it's blue. And I think the only way we change that is we have to make sure that interaction that we do have at the facility. And I'll give you a really good example. When I was at 24 Hour Fitness, one of the things that we were working on was we had 5 million members. And we said, okay, about, let's say 1.8 million of those were active. We were saying, could we change the onboarding process? So before someone speaks to a salesperson, could we actually find out truly why that individual was there? Because then that changes the tour of the facility by the salesperson. It changes the conversation. It changes how we approach them emotionally. And then the trainer then has a lot more to work with. And I think we do a lot of the same things the same way. And I think it's about changing and looking at that very, very differently. And I think we have to, because I think otherwise it's not going to come back. Now, I still think there's going to be 8 to 9% of people, Mo, that are going to want a PT. And they're wealthy enough and they'll probably still do it regardless. But I just don't think I don't think we're going to be able to drive it into a larger audience. And that's why I think when you start to tap into wellness and you start to be able to collect that data, become a recovery coach, become a performance coach, now all of a sudden, forget the 9%, now we're dealing with the other 91%. And can we penetrate that audience? Because everyone's getting into recovery now. Well, why can't I penetrate that? So why can't, as a trainer or a coach, why can't I do, so for instance, a person says no to the PT consultation. Can't I just follow them up in a couple of weeks' time? Hey, say, Mo, how's that strength program going? And you may say, you know what, I'm a bit fatigued, or it's not great. You might say, why don't you come back with me and just spend every 2 weeks with me, and we'll do a recovery-only session. Because it looks like you know what you're doing with strength. You've got your social media stuff. You've got your programs. Why don't we just focus on that? And all of a sudden now I can touch the other 91% who are now possibly looking at longevity and recovery, and not worry you so much about that 9% who we know are always going to probably want PT and probably pay for it anyway.
Do you think the very definition of a personal trainer is changing? And I ask that because when you look at the role, we had Dan on earlier, he talked about the role of accounting changing, and he mentioned a couple other job roles, and they've evolved along with technology. And I wondered, are we thinking about the model the wrong way? Here's an example. If you purchase a new car, typically they'll offer you this car service plan for 4 years. So you have to pay for service, but you're really prepaying for service. And I've wondered, and maybe you have an answer for this, but why would a gym not say, instead of $100 a month, I'm going to charge you $150 a month, and that's going to enable you to 6 sessions, or it's going to enable you, I think, to 2 things. 1, you're prepaying for some training sessions, or 2, you have an increased price, but you've got access to experts in recovery, in nutrition for maybe 3 or 4 hours a month. Because I think for a lot of people who are coming in with their own information, and they need help and a consult to help them. I mean, listen, I'm sure each one of us gets our friends and family saying, hey, I just saw this. Can you guys help me with this? What do you think about that? So imagine if you just, I mean, from a revenue perspective, to win revenue back, we're so used to this model of you pay for your dues here, you pay for personal training here and add-ons here. But what if we just offered a membership type that enables you to have access to experts? Because one, you don't have as many now since they're all coming back. Have you seen any gyms do that?
I haven't seen anyone do it, but we are going to do it in Hong Kong. And so it's going to be called high performance living. And it's going to be targeted initially at executives. And what that does is it will include a lot of the things you said, Mo. So it's really, and you don't have one designated person that provides the whole service. So you have your recovery coach that takes you through this recovery facility that we're building. You have your private one-on-one with a PT. You also have your private for stretching, and then you've got your nutritionist who you can speak to online, or they can actually come to your business location, and it's all part of the package. So they pay an annual fee for that, and it's a bit more around when we talked about things like the $40,000 membership, whether it was Moira or whether it was Equinox. This one I think it's a little bit more thorough in that you've got 5 or 6 different SKUs, to your point, Mo, but you might have a different coach for each one. And it doesn't have to be the same coach all the way through. Why not have the recovery coach be the recovery coach specialist? Why not have the PT be the PT specialist if they want to do that? Or they may have dual roles, but you're definitely right. And I think we have to now, we don't have a choice anymore, Mo. I think we have to explore different types. And I know they've explored a lot of things over the years. Obviously, everyone's tried a lot of different models, but I think now it's at the point now where we really have to think it through differently, because I think the outcomes will be better if we start thinking it now. And I think part of it is, again, you've got to have a workforce that's experienced. And if you don't educate them, it doesn't matter. Because even with a high performance living, if that experience with those coaches is poor, then it's not going to be worth the $25,000 a year, whatever it is that you pay for it.
You mentioned about education, and if someone's here employing personal trainers, or if they are a personal trainer themselves, based on what you've seen with a number of businesses across the globe, if there was an area where you would suggest narrowing down on, what would they be? Like, we talked about soft skills. We also talked about the importance now of social media, recovery. Very broadly speaking, are there some key things that would make time to start investing now that could take several years for you to get to, but almost being fairly confident that those are things that are going to make a difference in the sort of medium to long term, as opposed to just a short-term fix?
Yeah, I think for sure. So when you look at soft skills, let's delve into that a little bit more, and I'll explain that more. So when we put together a soft skills course just recently, what we're looking at is trainers having empathy. And I always give this great example. Annette Lang is my favorite trainer in the world, always has been. Matt, you obviously know Annette. We held a conference about 16 years ago in Breckenridge in Colorado. We had every major health club chain there with their fitness director and some of their top trainers. And we had all these amazing speakers. And we had, Paul Chek, Charles Pollock, and we had everybody who was everybody, right? And then we had Annette Lang present. And I remember Charles Pollock was standing next to me, rest in peace. But Annette was talking, and she gives an example. She said, I've got this client. I ride my bike from Brooklyn. I go over the Brooklyn Bridge, and I go and train her. She's a new client for me. She's 95 years old, and she's lost her husband. She never leaves the house. So the family's contacted me and said, could you just go and maybe meet her? And so Annette meets her, and then she says, why don't we just start walking around the block? Let's just get you out of the house, because she obviously felt like that would be a really good starting point. So while they're walking around, the client turns to Annette and says, do you mind if I smoke while we walk? And when we had that room, there were 700 people in that room, and you could have heard a pin drop, because all the fitness guys are going, hell no, that is the stupidest thing and Annette's response was, of course she can smoke. And I remember Charles standing next to me going, why is she on that stage? Like, you've got all these great presenters. Why is Annette Lang there? And I said, let her finish the story. So she ends up finishing the story by saying, What do you think she did when she started to get healthier? The very first thing she did was she gave up smoking. And that's empathy. And that's what we used to call PTA Global, meeting people where they're at. And I think that skill set is personal training and coaching. And it's about the emotional side. And that's why I've always said AI won't be able to replace that, in my opinion, unless something miraculously changes. But so to answer that question, Matt, I think you've got to have that first, because that is the most important driver. Once you've got that, then some of the other things, I would say number 2 in line is understanding how to assess someone. And these days it's got to be about lifestyle first. You've got to understand where they're at. And I give the example with the recovery design that we built is that most people are dehydrated. So the worst thing we can do in this industry is put somebody into a sauna, you know? And if you're a female, the worst thing we can do is throw you into water colder than 6 degrees. Like, there's all of these things. And Kristen Holmes did a great, with some of her data, backed that up really, really well. So I think it's about being able to assess, and then it's then being able to probably now use AI for the program component. And then we've got to remember recovery sits 2 ways when it comes to personal training, because it's on the front end, which is called pre-recovery, and it's on the post end, which is post-recovery. And it's being able to understand how to then recommend and give them guidelines once they've left you and now they're going home. How can they recover? And it's things like nutrition, it's things like sleep, and it's all that component. So I would say, Matt, it's the soft skills, it's learning the assessment, and that piece ties into your PT consultation. And the difference with, I think fundamentally, and Ian O'Dwyer has drilled me on this, and he's right, you've got to get them on the floor. Make them move and feel better. And then when you come back in, they're much more likely to resonate with you, and you're much more likely to get an emotional connection because you've actually made them feel better. And then go ask them if they want to buy some personal training. Yeah.
I think that question regarding Annette and the analogy with smoking was really interesting, because I think being the fitness industry, we're so quick to dismiss actions, whether they be quick fixes or to say that you've got to drop all carbs, or you got to stop drinking alcohol, you got to not eat dessert and all the things. But in reality, it's really a little bit of movement, a little bit of moderation, and that's really where winning happens. And something related to that, and we've kind of in the last 2 years been through this journey as an industry, is GLP-1. I think when GLP-1s first came out, I think we all kind of felt this way. We're just like, is it, the efficacy of it was questioned. The safety of it was questioned. These things are still questioned. Do we support or promote GLP-1s as an industry? And even from a technology perspective, we were very hesitant, I would even argue resistant, to incorporating it. And instead what we found is the people who are getting on it, number one, if they weren't guided correctly, it was actually harmful, because 40%, you would lose 40% of muscle atrophy compared to 20% in regular weight loss. You're finding it harder to make those lifestyle changes because you just get a prescription. And then we found which is what changed the industry, is that it actually drove gym membership. So people were coming into the gym because they were on GLP-1 for 3 months, they lost some weight, they feel better, they're able to move, the movement, and now they're coming into the gym. I think that potentially could be an opportunity for personal training. Have you seen any, evolution in one thinking of GLP-1? And is anyone doing training or certifications to address that? Because that's not going away.
Yeah, I think I really struggled when GLP-1 came out, because I didn't know what I thought about it. And I had a sister that had lupus and was on steroids, was very overweight, and she went through stomach reduction surgery. And I remember I just didn't know how to address that. And then I eventually went to the surgery with her and then supported her through that, and I filmed it. And then I saw how much it dramatically changed her life afterwards. And then that changed my whole thinking on it. And then when GLP-1 came out, I actually thought I'd be more open to it, and I was actually a bit resistant to it. And then, knowing people like Pete McCall and Eric Durack and all these people who are now addressing it with education and training, it's a really important piece, because if we don't address the bone density issue and the muscle loss, then people are going to actually end up worse. So they're going to actually end up in a worse place. So to your point, I think GLP-1's a really important component. And I think the trainers who understand that, who have empathy and can put themselves into that person's shoes and then design and basically support them through that journey, I think it's a really important piece. It is not going away. And Mo, you probably know the numbers on it, but it's it's incredible what the percentage of people on GLP-1 now, right, or who have gone through that process.
It's roughly 6% of the US population either is in it or has been on GLP-1, and in 3 years, that's going to be 10% of the US population, which is just unbelievable.
Yeah, it's astronomical. And the great thing about it is they will, to your point, Mo, is a bit like Annette's story, is they will be able to move better. And if they move better, then hopefully they'll feel better. And if they feel better, then hopefully they'll want to do it again. And just one story on that for movement that you just made me think of there most. So I've just spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, and the thing that amazed me the most, I've always been curious about blue zones and about, you know, why people live the longest and all that sort of it. And what I've noticed there is that every single person moves all the time, regardless of age. And I remember I was walking up to the cable car, if anyone's been in Singapore, but the cable car is really, really steep if you walk up. And I did it at 5:30 in the morning last week. And there was probably 10 or 15 people that I passed that were at least 85 to 90 years old who were walking up, listening to their own music, talking, and they were so fit. And I noticed everyone sitting in food stalls where they'd always do arm warm-ups, they do leg warm-ups, and movement is key. You know, and we're designed to move. It's how we flush toxins. You know, it's our health is predicated on movement. So if the GLP-1s help people move and it can make them feel better, and a trainer can be positioned there, or a coach can be positioned to be an important part of that journey, I think it's really important. And I think they're probably the best positioned person to be able to do it.
We talked about some of the challenges that are facing operators and trainers. What about the opposite side? You know, have you seen any examples of people that are doing a great job? And if so, you know, what are some of the things that you have noticed about what they've been able to do over the last few years?
So you mean from the club perspective, or?
Yeah, club.
Yeah. I think what I've noticed is it's still individuals within each company. So I haven't seen a company grasp and do what they used to do. So if you used to look at Equinox as an example, I mean, I remember, so Michelle Dowcourt and Ian O'Dwyer, two of my best friends, probably arguably some of the best presenters in the world. And when they would go talk to a Tier X trainer at Equinox, they were nervous because they really knew their stuff. I would say that that's not something I see at all now. What I do see, though, is I see individual components of that. And there was a great trainer at, again, sorry to keep reverting back to Hong Kong, but last week there was a young girl and she was training. I saw her train 3 clients while I was working out. And I went up to her afterwards and I just said, that was incredible the way you just did that. Her communication was incredible. Her cueing was incredible. And I spoke to her clients and they said, she's changed our life. We love her. And I asked her, how did she educate herself? And she said, all on her own dime. So unfortunately, you know, that was a situation where I think that's sort of where it's a bit at. I think people that do stand out, it's individuals here and there. And I think, and I'm talking again within the health clubs, I think a lot of the top guys have now gone elsewhere. And I think that's unfortunately where it's at. They have to go and do their own education. They have to go and find it themselves, whereas before it used to all be provided. So Matt, I'd say I haven't had an example where I've seen a whole company really embrace it and do what Equinox used to do, for example. Lifetime's got a really powerful system too, but it's not the same level of education and training like it used to be. So,
well, we're almost at time, and we typically like to wrap up with a final thought. This has been a great session. If there is a key takeaway regarding personal training for the audience, what would that be?
I think it's never going to go away. I think we have to believe that. We have to truly believe that that is something that people need. And I think we have to educate and train more than anything. I think that fundamentally makes the difference. And I think if we can teach empathy to every trainer, whether they're great at their skill set or not, they'll do a great job. So my takeaway would be, you know, educate, educate, educate. But if we, as we drive things back, understand that there's a human being in front of us. A lot of times they're very scared, they're very nervous, they're very intimidated. And if we understand that and we have empathy, we can help a lot of people.
Matthew, how about you?
I think I was quite shocked with your answer to the last question that, you know, you know a lot of operators, you travel around the world, that you weren't able to think of somebody that has figured it out at the moment. So I guess in some ways that represents a great opportunity. You mentioned the guys that Until, you know, they've certainly got a unique model which is sort of allowing personal trainers to flourish in a very, very different way. But Yeah, I guess very surprising that that's the sort of state we're in at the moment.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't give you a better answer.
Mo, what about you?
Well, I think there's one which I didn't ask, but I kind of knew the answer, and I didn't want to name drop anyone, but I was going to ask, is there a certification company that's doing things the right way? I think I know the answer. It's probably not one that you're aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I could get myself in a lot of hot water now. Thanks, Mo.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think if you look at the big name ones, I think the problem that's happened is that because the clubs weren't investing in education, they haven't really had to renew or update any of their content because they would have been wasting their money. And I think only now we're starting to see it come back. I think in terms of high caliber, some of the smaller companies like Faster here in the UK do an amazing job because they address all the things that we talked about. If it was NASM and ISSA and all of those, I would say that they've lost their shine. And I've put pressure on them because I want them to come back because they're important and we need them to come back. And I think they just need to focus a bit more on getting the content more relevant to what it needs to be. And it needs to be GLP-1. You know, it needs to be soft skills. It needs to be all the things that we used to do rather than the same old things like the overhead squat assessment, which has really sort of done its time. And I think it needs to shift and it needs to include lifestyle.
I guess also though, you know, developing a product is very expensive, and researching a product. And I suppose if the market isn't there, then why develop it as well?
Well, I think that's the main reason why. Yeah, I think they haven't needed to do it. Whereas I think, you know, anyone here who's a trainer, you know, if you look back to the days when NASM was Mike Clark and firing, that was probably the most exciting time to be in the industry. Because everybody was excited when we were traveling with them with PT on the Net. I mean, it was such a fun environment. And trainers were pumped and clubs were pumping and you'd never seen training doing so well. And I just feel like all that excitement's just evaporated. So it's about trying to bring that back, I think. And I think, so my challenge to them would be, in a very positive way, not trying to be negative, is shift that focus so that we can get that excitement back. You know, bring back a Mike Clark style person who is so smart, so driven that we can land somewhere like that. So so I think...
Are we not seeing that though through, you know, podcasts and some of these new influencers that are almost like filling that void in a different way to some of the traditional companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if you look at like Andrew Huberman, for instance, right? Andrew Huberman takes the white papers, he addresses the white papers, but it's still not really as relevant to a trainer. So he's got so much traction. Joe Rogan, the same thing. It's all sound bites. Where the trainers need a bit more, sort of, I don't know what the word is, but they just need more volume to it. And it needs to be more relevant to them. So while there are some amazing influencers and people are getting this information and it is helping drive the conversation around things like recovery, longevity, all those pieces, it's not really designed for the trainer. And I think the trainers need more of that grounding around what they're actually dealing with, which is a human being who, Mo, you said it before, they're looking for a relationship as well. They're not just looking for, you know, Craig Harper is a really, really famous trainer, always said, you know, you don't want them to be your best friends, but you need to have that type of relationship. So,
well, we live in a completely incredible time. I think personal training is going to be transformative. They're going to have more tools available to them, and I think they'll be able to improve health outcomes at a pace that they weren't able to do before, see more people, have a broader impact. Well, that's a wrap, Matthew. What do you think about doing L.I.F.T.S live?
Yeah, I think we should do more. Yeah, I think we should have Richard on again.
We should. We've had him on once or twice already, right? It's the third time.
You need to get Michelle and Ian on too.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody. I'd like to thank you guys that are sort of stayed back. I think they're going to sort of kick us out the door now. So I appreciate, we appreciate you guys for staying and listening to Richard. Hope you've got value from the session. And if you've got any questions for him, he's here to chat. Thank you again.